Okay, getting off the biography of Tolkien and on his background, following this trajectory of his biography matters, but the literature matters as much in its own way on its own grounds. We're now going to transition for the next several lectures into looking at Tolkien's literary world. What is it? What does he say about it? And then what are the themes, at least from my vantage point, that I find sort of being drawn out as the story unfolds? I actually flirted with assigning the Silmarillion, but it's like dark chocolate. Like, you're only going to have a bite of it here and there, and you're not going to just sit down and eat a whole lot of it. You're not going to want to sit down and read the whole book in like one sitting. It's good if you get into this world and you want to learn a little bit more about Tolkien's backstory. And I think if I give you kind of a synopsis of it, it actually might be more interesting if you ever sort of peruse it at some point, or even if you read it. The Silmarillion. Now, what is the Silmarillion? What is going on with this book? It's a strange name. First of all, it's actually part of it's actually an Elvish name. A Silmaril in the Elvish language is a jewel. And it's a whole backstory of all of the creation and history of Middle-earth up until Lord of the Rings. Now, it doesn't function. Now, this is where people get thrown off. It does not function the same way as Lord of the Rings. It doesn't even, you're almost sometimes out wondering if it's the same person, the way the writing is, the way the thing is structured. Now, there's a reason for that. A couple of them are, just real quickly, one is it was actually published posthumously. Tolkien actually didn't work it up to be a full manuscript for publication. He had written a lot of it on his own. Again, this was sort of the thing, the Silmarillion and all these tales were things he was already kind of working on back in 1917, 1918, when he began to write down these stories. But what happens is he submitted it, it was rejected. The publisher didn't even read all of it. He just stopped at a certain point and said, no, not a chance. And so all of the hard labor Tolkien did to make Lord of the Rings accessible and good and have a good flow to it, he didn't do to the Silmarillion. His son published it. So there are chapters that are only like 20 pages, or big sections rather, that are only 20 pages. There are all kinds of sort of tantalizing things that he mentions that you're like, well, I wonder what happened there, and we just don't know. There's all kinds of history. That's one. The second is the Silmarillion covers thousands of years, not just a couple of years, not just a short series of years. It's thousands of years of this backstory history. So it's very sort of broad stroke, sweeping history. So that's the Silmarillion. Now, just to sort of give you an example of the kind of world that Tolkien created, you're seeing right now on the screen a map. This map is Tolkien's world, the world he created overall. If you count the Silmarillion, the history of Middle-earth, all the tales that he wrote, and Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. The red box that you're seeing is the small chunk of land where Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit takes place. That's the extent of, he has two continents, put it that way. And The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings only occur on one chunk of one continent. In other words, all these stories, Silmarillion and stuff, happen in all these other places. You don't have to know that in general, but you have to sort of get a sense of the scale of the world that Tolkien created. I find, frankly, the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit to be large enough of a world that he created, but it was only a fraction of the world that he created overall. Yes, yes, great question. The Western world is the Undying Lands, it's the Elvish lands. It's not heaven. That's usually a big screw up. It's not heaven that they go to. It's the Elvish lands. More on that in a minute. Well, Tolkien does a bit more of the piecemeal. I think what it is for Tolkien, he does so much pre-work before he even gets to the Hobbit. He's got, dozens, about a little over a dozen years into this world, and it's just the way he worked. Lewis is creating more on the fly. No, he is creating deeply and more, he's more of a deep thinker on this than I think some people give him credit for. But Tolkien's mind just worked a different way. I mean, the creation of languages, the creation of these cultures, the fact that he has two continents and he only tells you about one fraction of them, there is something in his, some people might say he has a screw loose, some people might say he's got a very creative imagination. There's all kinds of ways to describe it. I find it to sort of be very interesting. Now, a lot of what happens on all these continents and the Silmarillion and all this stuff, and I'm not going to go into all the detail, I'm going to give you the big sweep of it, is a lot of his favorite tales in fictional literature comes home to roost. So one of his favorite stories growing up was the story of Atlantis, the island that sinks in the Greek story. And he actually puts that story into the backstory of Lord of the Rings. He just liked it. So he created this island. You'll see it right there in the middle. He created this island of people, and then eventually they, through their own sin, God sinks the world, sinks that island as a result. And he just thought this is a great kind of merging of the Atlantis myth with the true biblical story of the flood narrative and the Tower of Babel, the sin element. And he just created this whole story. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, is this map actually, did he left up this map?
He did not draw this map, no. This is an idealized map of... There are different versions, yes. Just, again, you don't have to know the geography, you don't have to know this, but I think visually and being able to see where stuff happens helps me. The Silmarillion, though, again, published posthumously in 1977. It was originally intended to be a sequel to The Hobbit, and it was edited by Tolkien's son, Christopher. Now, a lot of you have probably seen all the books coming hot off the presses with Tolkien's name on it. Children of Hurin. Chris Tolkien is still he's still alive. He's still doing all these things to this day. The recent edition of Tolkien's translation of Beowulf just came out just a matter of weeks ago, really. All this is by Christopher. Christopher has just been an enormous benefit because he has all of his father's papers and all this stuff, and he's able to just kind of put out, he actually had more work, his father had more work than we were aware of. So the Silmarillion was finally published, and it was not a major success, but it became a resource for people that wanted to try to figure out Lord of the Rings better. And the book is broken up into 5 sections. And again, I think part of the problem is it's all written in Elvish language. The titles, rather, not the actual book. But there's Ainulindale, there's the Valaquinta, there's the Quinta Silmarillion, Akalabeth, and then Of the Rings of Power. They're all up there on the screen. I've just sort of in my own brackets given you essentially what happens in each one of them, each one of the sections. The very first section deals with the creation of the world. The very next section deals with what I've chosen to call the sub-creation of the world. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time on that theme because that is a massive one for Tolkien. How is it that we, as God's image, being created by a creator who simply creates for his own pleasure, what elements in our own creative lives do we see that mimic God? That is one of the biggest things for Tolkien, that he actually used the phrase sub-creator, that we are sub-creators. We think God's thoughts after him. All of our creations are imperfect and imprecise, but we're like children fumbling to be like our Father. We want to create the same way he creates, and even when I got home last night, for example, on the dresser was my daughter had drawn this goofy little picture by objective sort of artistic standards. It was actually a beautiful thing. Honey, if you're watching this, I'm sorry. Just put that out there. Anyway, but she drawn this sort of stick figure and all that stuff, and my wife and the kids are going to a baby shower later today for a friend, and my daughter was drawing this whole thing. And, you just see this coming out of kids, and you're thinking, what instinct in them is it to do this, to be creative in this type of way? There's symbolism. I don't know why, but she drew a castle, and everyone's wearing a crown, and the girls are princesses, and the boys are knights, and she's just done this whole motif, and you're going, what is it in a 5-year-old that thinks that this is how you ought to represent the world and create the world and those kinds of things? Well, for Tolkien, and I go with him on this, it's because we're in God's image. God is a creator. He is the perfect creator, and we, as his image, always have within us the capacity to be creative or to try to cultivate. For some of you, you don't have a musical or an artistic bone in your body, but you do try to cultivate things. You try to, I always joke, whenever you see a guy dominating his yard out there mowing and edging and weeding, all that stuff, and he's just trying to own that plot of land, part of it is he's psychotic, but part of it is there's this instinct to cultivate, to dominate, to do whatever. Probably everyone in this room has a place where they try to cultivate and nourish and sort of express their own creator-creature instinct in them. For Tolkien, the sub-creation is one of the biggest elements. And as we'll see in just a minute, he actually creates a story that seems weird at first, but actually is intended to describe this, in which God lets the angels that he creates help him create the world. Now, Tolkien's very clear that God is creating the world through them. It's not a Gnostic thing. But what Tolkien is basically saying is anytime God creates a creature, they immediately become creators in the sub-sense, in the derivative sense. More on that in a bit. But there's a sub-creation. So he basically covers in the last 3 sections, he covers all these hundreds and if not thousands of years of history, and it leads right into Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Again, I'm going to go over this very, very broadly. But if you were to ever pick up the Silmarillion, you would find these 5 sections. And, again, if one of the themes that you're interested in is this creation, sub-creation, ideally you'll keep these notes and you'll say, okay, I can just go read the first 2 sections and kind of get this stuff. If you actually kind of get into the backstory and the mythology, the creation stuff is interesting, but you want to kind of know more like who killed whom and what war happened and then what led to, Sauron, all this kind of stuff. The last 3 sections are where you get that kind of stuff. So I just want you to have that grid, at least generally speaking. Now, what's weird is some of these sections, again, are like 20 pages, 30 pages. The third one is really, really long. It covers kind of the whole backstory of the war of sin, the fall of man, the rise of essentially Satan, and the way he attacks the world, etc. But the other sections are much smaller. So let's go just, again, briefly, broadly, sweepingly through these sections so that you can at least see, again, I think, the way in which Tolkien actually is a theologian comes through in this. And I think if you get this running start when we get in a little bit to talking about Lord of the Rings explicitly, more things will pop up. First and foremost, Tolkien does have God in his stories. Now that's strange because God doesn't show up by name in either The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. There is an appeal repeatedly to fate or to some providence. That's actually one of the major themes for Tolkien, is the ways in which victory is always snatched from the jaws of defeat. Just when you think everything is lost, there is some, you can only use the word, miraculous way in which, not too conveniently, but there's a way in which the end result is for the betterment of the world. Take, for example, the classic one is the pity of Bilbo for not killing Smeagol, for not killing Gollum, eventually leads to the very ability for the ring to be destroyed because Frodo fails. And if it wasn't for Gollum for the pity of that at the end, it saves the whole result. And there are all kinds of examples like this. Tolkien loves to reflect on providence as this mysterious thing that isn't always very convenient, that it seems to be slower than you want it to be. And actually, you'll see an example of this in the creation story. For Tolkien, one of the supreme sins is trying to outpace God, expecting him to speed up to meet your convenience, not rather to follow his plan. But Tolkien does have God in his story. No, yeah, great question. Some of the prayers, the random, almost charismatic utterances that happen at times, like Elbereth is one. No, actually, those are the angels. You'll see in a bit. Like, I think that's where you notice some of his Catholicizing tendencies are in there, because he creates this sort of, I don't want to say pantheon, because I don't want to make it sound pagan, but he creates a host of angelic, the court of heaven kind of a system. And occasionally you can call upon or reach out to one of the angels or, in some ways, the saints.
My question is, did he develop this after writing Lord of the Rings, or was this
This was first. This was before Lord of the Rings. That's right. Yeah, he had the creation story and the mythology of that already worked out when he was writing Lord of the Rings, which is why he will suddenly have them call back to these periods that were formed in his mind, but they seem to, you're just like, I don't know what that means sometimes.
Elrond kind of says, I'm not getting involved.
Yeah.
I've been involved.
Yeah, we'll get there. Who are the elves? Are they guardians? The short answer is no. The elves serve a very specific purpose. I'll go ahead and tell it now. The elves are called the children of God with man. So it's man and elves are the two. The elves serve a literary purpose for Tolkien, which is because they seem to live on forever, it actually brings into stark contrast the quick life of humans. And repeatedly in Tolkien's works, man is considered to be the supreme creation of God. It's the image of God kind of motif. But Tolkien puts the elves right alongside them because they live forever, they are increasingly sorrowful. They actually have over time develop sadness because their lives never end and they just drag on, and the weight of the burden of a sinful, broken world actually makes them feel worse and worse as they live on. And they're actually, strangely enough, less able to achieve glory and honor and things for goodness, for the sake of goodness, than the human race is sometimes able to. And Tolkien will have these riffs where he'll talk about the speed of man, the speed of his life is what gives him strength to get up in every day and try to conquer something. So it serves a literary purpose to contrast humanity, but I will get there. There's sometimes said that elves are what humans are supposed to be. No. In the Silmarillion, it's very, very clear that they're a separate race. He just puts them in there in general, yeah. And I think so sometimes people say they're pre-fallen. They're not. If they're pre-fallen, they don't die. They shouldn't die. I mean, Tolkien's very clear on this. They're called the children. They're two groups, man and elves. They're the children of God, children of Eru. And the goal is that the two of them are just part of the creation. And then Tolkien talks then about how they actually fail. The elves fail in the Western world, so the Eastern world, in Middle Earth, and they therefore leave and all go to the Undying Lands. They all leave not because they're sad and they hate us, but because they're actually fading and failing, and their life is sort of fading away. So they go to the Undying Lands to wait for the eschaton in Tolkien's world. Yeah.
I mean, but I can kind of see that because the elves are kind of portrayed as, they're frequently portrayed as the wise ones,
Sure, because they've lived for a long time.
Well, man is, man does what he wants all the time. He ruins everything.
Right. That's more from the movies, though. I mean, the idea, that's one thing I don't like about the movies is they kind of do put the elves in this kind of semi-immortal, angelic state. They even kind of glow when they walk around a lot. And there's some of that in Tolkien's world when he's talking about it. But elves and humans in Tolkien's world are always relatively the same rank. Dwarves are not. More on that in a second. But yeah. 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 That's a good link. Yes, I think in general, but also because they were there historically. The question is Tolkien purposely using Chesterton's ethics of Elfland, the way he talks about fairy tales in general, or is it just he likes elves and he thinks they're cute and he puts them in the story? It's a bit of both. Tolkien liked elves because of the backstory, because of the fact that it was in the world that he was studying. But he believes they're very interesting characters in literature to be used as a way of sort of doing this stuff. But he's also very conscious of Chesterton's description of the way fairy tales function in our minds and in our hearts. In fact, there's one of the famous books that Tolkien wrote was called "On the Monsters and Its Critics." I think I'm saying that right. It's his essay and his lectures on Beowulf, and it's basically almost thematically the same as Chesterton's bit on Elfland. And he basically says, here's how fairy tales work. Here's why monsters are good for the soul, because they actually tell you that there's something like evil out there. Monster stories. Here's why fairy tales tell us of something of the need to conquer evil. And he just kind of paints this picture of there's a reason why these things always evoke a sense of wonder, is because we remember back to being children, and we remember how much we learned. There are evil things out there that need to be beaten, and here there are good people and good forces, good heroes out there that will do it. And so yes, is the short answer. He's definitely doing a little more Chestonian.
Of
Yeah. Short answer is no in the main sense. Are all the variety of races sort of a reverse Tower Rebel? No, not at the Fellowship of the Rings moment. We'll get there. Let me go through this, and you'll see kind of where all these races come from. But God in the Silmarillion is named. His name is Eru Iluvatar. And you can break down the etymology of it. Eru just means the one, or he that is alone. Very, at least echoing some of the concepts of I am, the ways in which God refers to himself. And then Iluvatar is the name in the Elvish language for the father of all, the creator of all, in a manner of speaking. So there is a creator God. And if you read the first opening sections of Silmarillion, he is very clearly the biblical God. He has no equal. Even the evil forces of the world are not on par with him. He is the creator of everything. Out of him came everything out of nothing. There have been plenty of people who have read the Silmarillion and who have said this is straight out of Genesis. It's given a lot of literary overtones, and he doesn't feel any need to worry. Like, for example, he creates his own words for the name of God in the Elvish language. He does get some criticism even in his own day for not, just using the Yahweh name or something like this, and he just says, I don't have to. I'm an English professor. I can make up names and do this kind of thing. But Eru Iluvatar, sometimes just referred to as Iluvatar, is God. And the elements of God and what he does when he creates in Tolkien's language is he gives people secret fire. You'll refer to Gandalf. If you think about Gandalf, he says, I am the keeper of the secret fire. People think that means some sort of mystic, weirdo wizard crap. It's not. It comes from God. Secret fire for Tolkien is a combination of life, creativity, and the freedom of being actually sentient beings who are sort of self-aware of the world around us, this kind of a thing. Bit like a soul. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I actually like that you say that. In the same way that you can say someone played that music soulfully, it does kind of hearken on that. Soul as the thing that is our creative force, the thing that is our unique sort of, the thing that is at least one of the driving elements of us being unique, that kind of thing. Yes, I think that's probably a good way of putting it.
So when he says, I'm a keeper of the sacred fire, it's sort of like I'm a guardian of life.
He's a guardian of life, yep. And we'll get to Gandalf in a bit. Gandalf is not human. He's also not God or Christ. He's actually an angel. You'll see that in a second. And he is one of the angels that come to help protect the world from the forces of evil, etc. But secret fire for Tolkien, it shows up a lot. It shows up in his letters. He refers to the secret fire. It's always that, we might use the word spark. It's that spark in us that drives us, all those kinds of things. It's almost a proper phrase, a proper noun for Tolkien. It's the secret fire. And in that is the concept I've already talked about, which is sub-creation. The idea that we are created by a creator who simply creates for his own pleasure. He doesn't create the world or us out of necessity. He just simply enjoys it. Thinking back to the Tolkien quote about, he just simply enjoys the sun rising and setting day in and day out, these kinds of things. Tolkien is very, very strong on this, that no matter what it is that drives us, no matter what our talent is, we might say today, that is planted in us by being creatures. And I do think theologically, I know I've said this before, I do think theologically we have to, as evangelicals, come back to a real strong concept of the creation of us as God's image. Because there are, those going into ministry, it's very easy to sort of think theologically and live in the biblical text. But you have countless numbers of people in congregations and in ministries who don't live in our world, who don't read theology books, who don't get to take classes on Lewis and Tolkien, and who, go to hospitals to work. They go to banks to work. They go to, maybe they're artists, maybe they're musicians, maybe they're all these different sort of backdrops. And they probably, if you scratch beneath the surface, are wondering, how in the world is what I do honorable to God? Should I just sell everything and go be a monk somewhere, kind of a concept? And the answer is I think theologically, not to say, no, God's okay with what you're doing, like in that kind of pedantic pat on the head sense, but rather a real robust understanding of God's creation. That if you're an artist, if you are a doctor, if you're a lawyer, whatever it is you do, those instincts to cultivate, to be effective, to whatever it is, are planted by God. It's not something that is irrelevant and secondary to your character. It's actually part of who you are. And therefore, discovering your talents is in some ways discovering God's will for your life. Knowing who you are is knowing how God made you, etc. That doesn't mean there's no opportunity for development of further talents, and that something couldn't just be a hobby. But that being said, I think we're going through sort of a plague in the church right now, where there are all kinds of people that don't know, as my boss sometimes says, how Sunday gets to Monday. They don't know how spiritual faith moves into everything they do week in and week out, whether it's work, creativity, all those kinds of things. Tolkien actually, I think, gives us a bit of an answer here. This idea that we are sub-creators, that what is that impulse in us that wants to dominate? Again, actually, when I go home tonight, I have to mow the lawn and do all this stuff because it's been a little too long. What is that instinct in me? This does happen, where I'm like, every weed is an assault on my dignity as the image of God. How dare you come into my plot of land? What is that? I have grown some fruit trees behind the fence of my house. And any bug that lands on it that tries to eat the leaves, I'm going to kill. It's kind of there's this cultivation, I think, mandate in us, what we call the cultural mandate in us, that always drives to this point. And you could probably, again, have countless examples of this in your life. Whatever it is that makes you tick instinctively in terms of your talent, that there's times when it just clicks on. And it's almost as if you're, again, not mystically in a trance, but it's almost as if there is sort of an effortless talent that God has given you that's sort of coming out, whatever it is. And that is, in Tolkien, the idea of the secret fire or sub-creation, the fact that this is who we all are.
Compared to this point with Tolkien or Lewis.
Yeah. Great question. Abraham Kuyper in the Culture Mandate. I don't think so.
How do you spell Kuiper?
Kuyper is Kuyper. I don't think so. If you've never heard of Kuyper, Kuyper is one of these. He's a Dutch Protestant writer who wrote a lot on this stuff of cultural mandate, of the ways in which he was actually in the world of politics, and his whole thing was, look, God has different spheres, but he's Lord over all of them. If you're in the religious sphere, he's Lord there, obviously, but if you're in the political sphere, the artistic sphere, etc., God is Lord over those as well, and the goal is to kind of this. I don't think so. I just think it comes out of from their reading of literature, I think. I haven't seen anything, at least. So this is for Tolkien a big, big subject, secret fire, sub-creation. Now, the first thing God creates is he creates a group called the Ainur, who are just simply the angels. They're angelic creatures. They are immortal in the sense that they don't die natural deaths, but they are creatures in the sense that they're not somehow equal with God. They are very much, again, just like the biblical angels, or the hosts of heaven, as we call them. All of those are creatures, but they are different than actual physical created entities like us. That's what the Ainur are. Now, the Ainur just simply means the holy ones, the angels. And what happens is Tolkien begins to talk about the creation of the world. Again, this is where it sometimes sounds Gnostic. It sounds like God is using sort of emanations of his being to create the physical world. That's not where Tolkien's going. What happens, what Tolkien sort of focuses on is, again, the concept of sub-creation. This is for me, I'm going to go and tell you, this is one of the most profound things that I think Tolkien ever writes or talks about, what I'm about to tell you. His concept of how the world is created and then how evil fits into that world is, I think, for my money, the best description of how we biblically understand the presence of evil in God's created world. Again, this is a literary device that he uses. But what Tolkien says is God, Iluvatar, creates these angels, creates the holy ones, the Ainur, and then he teaches them the art of music. And they learn the art of music, and they each have it. They don't learn it in the sense of mentally learning it. It's almost as if each one is created with as we might say, a song in their heart. There's something in them that is part of a melody. each one has its own sort of role to play in, now Tolkien doesn't call it this, but I would call it, in the symphony. If you ever go see a symphony, it's a bunch of different instruments and different tones all kind of playing at once. Sometimes this group's playing softly, sometimes this group's playing loudly, back and forth. But of course, a symphony is all of these things working together for an overarching musical piece, right? This is, in essence, what Tolkien paints in the concept of creation, that each of the angels is given a part to play in God's symphony of creation. Again, creator, sub-creator is very much what he's playing on here. So they're taught the art of music, and the void, which is, again, sort of a nothingness prior to the physical world, is, he says, filled with the music of heaven. Not unlike when Lewis in the Space Trilogy is talking about Ransom going up in the ship, and he goes into the vacuum of space, and he expects it to be lifeless and cold, and instead the sort of sheer radiance of divinity, you might say, or of God's glorious creation sort of is actually it's actually the opposite of a void or a vacuum. Tolkien has that as well. In this, quote, void, there is the ringing of heaven, the song of heaven, the art of music being played. Well, God, Iluvatar, then has them sing creation into being. Now, again, this is one of those bits that Lewis very aggressively sort of takes into his own writing later in life. But this is we're certain comes from Tolkien's sort of way of describing it. But it's, again, you have to understand this. The angels are the ones singing, but it's technically they're singing because God created them to do that singing. Again, it's creator, sub-creator. It's not that God isn't creating the world and he's, some sort of weird spiritual force. He's not a first mover kind of a thing. Tolkien repeatedly says they have their song from him. They have their song from him, these kinds of concepts. It's just a way of describing creation.
He's singing everything.
No, yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of like the nuancing of it. Yeah. In Magician's Nephew, it is only Aslan. No one is playing an extra part in there at all. But no, the singing part of it certainly is at least similar. And as you say, the Ainur or the angels, their creation is secondary, and each has a theme or a melody in the overall sort of symphony of God. I find that pretty interesting. I do. I find it, at least literarily, sort of an interesting kind of way of describing the beauty of creation. Now, the theology of it, according to Tolkien, is that as God creates these angels, they only know their part, but as they're singing the elements or the themes or the melodies of their music, they actually then become aware that others are singing as well, and they realize that God himself has woven together the symphony. So again, the whole idea is that each angel is just sort of following God's pattern, following God's plan. God is still doing all the creating. And Tolkien is very clear that the creation itself is made for his pleasure. It's not out of necessity. There's no primordial urge in God. I feel all alone. I better create something. Nothing like that. It's rather he wants to enjoy creation because he is a God of enjoyment and of good pleasure in the biblical sense. And I do think that's biblical as well. The phrase "it was good" is far more significant than it's all right. That's not what God is saying. God is declaring profoundly that this is a good creation that he has made. And with the Ainur, or the angels, I say here, that their singing, their melody is both individual yet corporate. Again, a very sort of interesting play that Tolkien brings out a lot, that individuals have tasks and roles, but that by doing what's best for them, what they're called to do, their one task, they always become aware of the others that are in support roles around them. More on that later when we get more into Lord of the Rings. One more quick little element to this. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Like an angel.
Yeah. He's not an Ainur, though. He's a lesser angel. There's ranks.
Is that equivalent also to the wizards then, or do they take?
Yep. Short answer is yes. Yeah. And that's why Gandalf comes back to life. It's not because he's Jesus and he's incarnated again, or he's resurrected. But you'll see he's a lesser angel. We'll get there. Yeah. It all go. Oh, okay, that makes sense. I'll go ahead and give you another little nugget. Balrogs, the big fiery flamethrowers, are lesser angels who've been corrupted and follow Satan now. And that's why Gandalf, that's the only, in the movies and in the books, that they get it right. It's the only time Gandalf says no. Like, that's when he finally sort of unveils himself as like, no, you will not do this, is because it's equal power against equal power. And other times, I always laugh. Gandalf's just like, so what do you guys think? I'm just hanging out with you guys. Just go ahead and do it. Like, he has all this power, but he doesn't wield it for them until, like, this Balrog, his equal, comes to and he will just crush them. And then he stops them, so.
You keep using the name Satan.
I keep using the word Satan. Yeah, let me go to the next one. Satan, it is clearly Satan. The guy, the figure's name is Melchior. It's not Sauron. Sauron is actually not Satan, believe it or not. He has satanic elements to him. But Melchior, or his name is Morgoth, in Tolkien's world, is the original Satan. Melchior is the greatest angel, the first angel created. He is sort of, in terms of not pantheon, but in terms of the company of heaven, he is, we might call it the supreme angel. His name means arises in might in the Elvish tongue, and he is the one who falls, and therefore takes with him a number of the company of angels, and with him begins to not only corrupt the angels, but he begins to corrupt creation as well, and he attacks it. And so all of the evil creatures you see in Tolkien's world, orcs and wargs and all these sort of various creatures, all the corruption you see is always a manifestation of the original corruption and the fall of the attacking of God's good creation. Again, more on that a little bit more. Now, what's interesting about this is Melchior, again, I think there's no way to read that, to see that Melchior is an angel who falls and takes a company of angels with him and then attacks creation. That's clearly Satan. So I will use the name Satan and Melchior back and forth just so that you can at least, just as I'll say God in the Iluvatar, because even though Tolkien is not trying to say this is directly from biblical sources, it's very clear he's saying something about his understanding of the biblical God. And here he's talking about the fall in sin, and he's saying something about the nature of evil biblically through his literature. And so I will morph back and forth between Satan and Melchior, just because otherwise people are going, wait, who's Morgoth, who's Melchior? It's actually frustrating enough that he has two different names for the same guy, but yeah. So at the end of it, Melchior is the greatest angel. He is a creation of God as an angel. He's not a primordial evil deity that's on par with God. He is a creation of God, who falls into rebellion and therefore tries to take others with him. Again, this is straight biblical, just sort of is right out of the pages of the Bible itself. But it actually, even when I read it in this story, and it actually, I found myself thinking, this is incredibly interesting because I don't reflect on that enough. The nature of evil, the problem of evil, we call it, the theodicy question, is a real challenge. It's a hard thing to wrestle with as a creature. It doesn't mean we doubt God or we think there's a problem, but you have to wrestle with the presence of evil in our world that was created by God, and he's over it providentially. I mean, Satan didn't trick him, and God's like, oh, man, you got me. God, in some ways, knew, and in some ways, we use the word allowed it to happen. He didn't create evil. God is not the creator of evil. He is the good creator God. But he somehow allowed the rebellion to happen. Well, this is exactly what happens in Tolkien's world. The rebellion happens. Melchior, or Morgoth, or Satan does this very same thing. Now, here's what I find absolutely fascinating. Melchior's fall in Tolkien's world is he creates his own music. He creates his own dissonance within a symphony. There are certain chords and certain notes that if you put them within an arrangement, within a chord structure, if you're actually paying attention, it's that kind of like that feeling of like you kind of want a resolution in the music. Dissonance is sometimes used effectively in music, but sometimes if you're playing the piano, for example, and you miss a note, the dissonance of that note is what you hear that kind of makes you feel like something's off. There are chord structures and there's all these kinds of things. Here's a little side note on the history of music. There was at one time in the Middle Ages something called the devil's chord. You can play it? It's a what is it? It's a seventh, right?
It's a tritone.
It's a tritone. Yeah, go play it. While I'm describing it. It's literally called the devil's chord. There we go. Yeah, there. Like that little step up. And it's called the devil's chord because it doesn't naturally resolve. There's no like completion where it rests. Now, no one in the Middle Ages actually thought the devil invented this chord, but they were just saying that music needs to have a resolution at the end of it, right? Well, the devil's chord, that chord, believe it or not, this is why people in the 20th century hated heavy metal and rock music, is it was the basis of heavy metal and rock music, was the tritone chord. Did you know that? About the tritone? Black Sabbath was the starter of, I don't know why I'm talking about this, but Black Sabbath, was the first song they ever wrote was the tritone note. Now symphonies had been doing it for a while before. They played with dissonance and then resolution. But when you hear that off note, there's always instinctively, even if you know squat about music, there's this instinct to want to kind of hear the resolution kind of land, right? There you go. Yeah. The speed with which Melchior tries to do things, right, exactly. Well, all that story about music, again, if you know nothing about music, you should know that this is the essence of music. This is the reason why a lot of sort of popular music is always the same three chords. It resolves in a very simple way, and it's very pleasant to even the untrained ear. Well, what Melchior's sin is, this is more of an analogy. This is more of a literary way of describing sin. Melchior sings out of tune. In other words, sin for Melchior is not a thing, it's a rebellion. The corruption of it is he wants his own music, he wants his own symphony, and he wants it played in a dissonant way with no resolution so that God's plans are ultimately thwarted and they rest on him. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true biblically. When you look at Genesis 1-3, you have harmony in relationships between creation and God. You have a harmony in relationships between us as humanity and creation itself. And you have a harmony with Adam and Eve. And the immediate fallout is a disharmony and a rebellion and a breakdown of all those relationships.
Is that also like the inner desire then to seek resolution as well? You can explain that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the desire for that resolution. Yeah, creation groans. Exactly right. Creation is groaning for the resolution of that end. And so, but for Tolkien, in running it through this concept of music, God has created the symphony, he has created the melodies, and the sin is, I will sing out of tune. I will sing a dissonant note. I will sing my own tone. I will sing exactly how I want to sing, which is a brilliant way of saying that sin isn't a force on its own. It's a rebellion against the good of God, which is biblical. Sin isn't some evil devil with a red pitchfork that's out to sort of stab us. Now, of course, Satan is a crouching lion. Peter says, I'm not saying that the devil is sort of weak and impotent in that sense, but rather everything Satan does, biblically speaking, is to corrupt what God has done. The devil doesn't create his own empire. The devil tries to corrupt God's empire, tries to end God's world. He is the twister of things. All the variety of different names for Satan always involve him twisting, perverting, corrupting, taking good things and making them evil. And therefore, this is exactly what Tolkien is talking about, that Melchior is a creature, he is not a creator, but he wants to actually be the creator. That the nature of sin is I want to be God. I don't want God to be over me and me be a creature. Again, I think in terms of just trying to understand this, Tolkien's onto something, I think, here. What's funny, though, is that as the sort of story goes on, is it becomes a battle of song, sort of like a dance-off. It's not really, but it's Melchior keeps, what ends up happening is Melchior keeps singing out of tune, and this is what I find to be actually very profound. God in his plan takes all the dissonant notes that Satan or Melchior keeps trying to sing, and he weaves them into the symphony and resolves all of them. Which is, I think, about as profound a concept of the way that God is providentially over sin, yet not the creator of it, yet he is the resolver of it. That as the dissonant notes come up, God's like, ha, got it, and he brings it back down to the completion musically. And again, it keeps happening over and over and over again, where Melchior tries to ruin the symphony, and God, in his position as God, resolves the music and makes it kind of land with this kind of effortless sense. The Job story is the go-to point where if people tend to want to make Satan this kind of equal with God, or, I mean, there are some who, in an effort to try to describe the biblical story, wrongly describe it as a chess match between God and Satan, as if God moves and Satan moves, and it's this kind of equal power kind of back and forth, and then, at the cross, God wins. Like, checkmate. And it's everywhere. People have tried to describe it that way. It's up there with the Trinity is like water, which is a modalistic heresy. But what ends up happening is they in their effort to describe the back and forth with sin and God, with Satan and God, they actually give Satan too much power. And Job is always the go-to where God has to allow Satan to do things before he can even do it, which is mind-blowing to begin with, to think that God would allow it. That's the hard part of the problem of evil, is if God could stop it, why doesn't he? Of course, then you're getting into the question of, are we challenging God, this kind of thing. But it's something we could wrestle with without challenging God. And if you haven't been through significant tragedy or trauma in your life, when that does happen, and it will happen at some point in your life, that's when the moment comes sort of crashing in. How do I wrestle with the tragedy of this moment? If you need a great example of this, go read Lewis and his A Grief Observed, where he's describing the death of his wife and his own grief. Those opening chapters, very few Christians would write that honestly today about it. They would sanitize it with pietistic nonsense that, oh, God is on the throne, when really in their heart they're going, why? But Lewis is very bold. Why? What the Job story, to go back to what we were saying, is a perfect example that God is the one who's God. Satan, for all of his twisting and perverting of the world, is not anywhere close to on par with God because he's a creature. And Tolkien is very, very clear on this. So he is horrible. And Melchior or Morgoth, the Satan figure in the Lord of the Rings or the Tolkien world, still makes war on creation. He still tries to corrupt it, pervert it, destroy it. He makes war on every creature of humanity, of the world. But he always fails, and he always is defeated. And in God's sort of mysterious providence, Tolkien always shows, like sometimes it seems like he's winning, but really at the end he's not. And that's the long theme of providence that you'll see repeatedly in Tolkien. What happens though is there ends up being, as I say here, a battle of song in heaven, and it resolves itself very, very specifically. God reveals essentially the first movement of creation, all of the ways in which they have sung their song. Essentially what's happening is God reveals the music as they're singing it to them as sort of his whole picture. Melchior seeks to dominate it, and I love this phrase. He seeks to dominate it with loud, vain, and endlessly repeated music. It's just sort of like this. That's a good example of lots of music throughout history. I don't mean just popular music, but it's loud, vain, and endlessly repeated. Which again, Tolkien doesn't seem to know squat about music, but he seems to get how music works, which is I find very interesting. Which is that like, sometimes repetition is good, a refrain, but then again, if it's loud, vain, and just constantly repeating the same thing over and over again, it's not music. It's just sort of.
I was going to ask, why music? Why did he pick?
Why music? Great question. I don't know. I just think he found it to be a beautiful example. You could say, why not art? Why not something else? This kind of thing. The great thing about music is it's. My answer, if it were me, would be the great thing about music is it can be played with multiple people. It has a symmetry to it as well, and there's all kinds of themes of dissonance and resolution, and all those kinds of things that play well in the music. Honestly, I don't know. This is just where he lands. Melchior seeks to dominate it with loud, vain, and endlessly repeated music, and then, as you say, God weaves Melchior into the symphony. Not in the sense of just sort of evil is okay, but in the sense of as the dissonant notes come up, God does not allow that to ruin it, but rather incorporates it into the entire melody. Melchior resists, and there are repeated attempts to destroy the song of creation that never actually come to an end. And then here's the quote at the very end. He says at some point the halls of heaven, it doesn't call it heaven, but the halls of the world are rattling with all this sort of loud music, this sort of battle. And what happens is God finally puts an end to it. He says here, with one cord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, and piercing as the light of the eye of a Luvatar, or God. That basically God just sort of ends it with one chord, and finally there's this resolution of, it's sort of, all right, stop, and it's just done, and the symphony ends. And that's the end of it. And at that point, Melchior, all of his attempts to corrupt and end creation and pervert it and corrupt it and make it his own comes to no end at the end of it. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting that both Lewis and Tolkien,
Or a toxicity in the bloodstream almost, that the sin is not only the legal sense of I'm guilty of having done something. And I think it's absolutely true, because biblically speaking, sin is judicial. It's the covenantal curse that we have fallen and we are guilty, and therefore we should receive the covenant curses of death. But it's also described as corrosive. It's described as sickness, as a thing that is wearing us down over time and taking good things and perverting them. And with Tolkien and Lewis, I do think there's a good right emphasis on this as well, because what you'll see repeatedly, particularly in Tolkien, is that the corruption of sin is not just some guy goes bad and tries to kill the good guys, but even the good guy trying to do the good thing, but doing it vainly and selfishly, though not realizing it, having been corrupted, ends up doing the wrong thing. It's the story of Boromir. It's even Gandalf who says, don't give me the ring. I will try to use it for good, and then I will become evil myself. That there is in Tolkien in particular, there's a real rich understanding of how sin affects us. Not just, I go off and, rob banks and, shoot the place up and, get on drugs. Oh, it's not all the worst possible things where I obviously am breaking my life apart. But it's the corrosive elements of the day in and day out narcissism that is in everybody, that could lead even well-intentioned people corrosively down the wrong path. And that's actually, again, Tolkien in The Problem of Evil, he has as rich, I think, an understanding of it literarily than anyone else that I've ever read. I haven't read everybody, but in terms of his understanding of the ways in which sin can go down all these different channels and can corrupt, is, I think, a biblical pattern. It's not just, well, the people that do those bad things are the real sinners, and we just have little white lies, but rather, even the narcissism of separating us from the really bad sinners is the point of where sin has corrupted us and made us narcissistic. Did I see a hand?
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking.
Great question. Is the One Ring an example of the one attempt to sort of destroy things? Not in the sense of the music, because the one chord is God's chord to end it. First, but also, but it is in that same vein, because the One Ring is by Sauron, who is a lesser sort of, he's a cult follower of Melchior, so he's actually a lesser evil guy. But that being said, the One Ring is an example, though, of Tolkien's world. I'll tell the story briefly in a bit, but I'll go ahead and give you the synopsis now. Essentially, what happens is there are good rings being made. And in their perversion in the sort of selfish desire to make more powerful things, Sauron basically tricks and tempts people into sort of doing it for their own sake, and then he is able to then learn the craft and make this One Ring that's going to just sort of take them over. So in other words, Sauron becomes a little corrupter, a little perverter of things, in the same way Melchior is kind of the big corrupter. What that means in Tolkien's world is a bit of a mystery. Well, he seems to have two satanic kind of figures, but Sauron is not the biggest of the baddest guys. He's a lieutenant, you might say. But as again, I'm going to give you two stories as we go through this before lunch. But what he ends up doing is he corrupts people by appearing to be good at first, and it's only when you get to the Lord of the Rings that God doesn't allow him to appear to be good anymore.